not sure. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our opening panel discussion. And thanks to Jeff and Sally for bringing us together in this extraordinary way and in this extraordinary place. I'm delighted to join all of you at one of the world's oldest and most important universities. Dean Swift, a former Oxford dean, called Oxford a truly great seat of learning because he said all freshmen had to bring some learning with them to be admitted, and no senior ever took any learning away. So the learning steadily accumulated here. We will need that accumulated knowledge tonight as we look to the extraordinary changes that are taking place in the world around us and explore not only the ways to survive these crises that arise from these dramatic changes, but to create new opportunities out of them through innovation to improve the well-being of humanity. Each generation, of course, insists that the change it experiences is more rapid and profound than ever before. But it is the pace of change today in the global economy, in our culture, in our climate that truly is accelerating and doing so exponentially. Today, Facebook has 845 million active users. That number is expected to reach 1 billion by August. Each day, there are more iPhones sold than people born in the world, and now you know the reason why. But the world in the next 40 years will add 2 billion more people. But importantly, it's not only the number. They'll be more technologically, physically connected than ever before. They'll be distributed in unprecedented ways, with cities swelling with more young people and more older people. Our rapidly globalizing reality feels increasingly complex. Everything is happening faster and faster. On the green line, you can see the amount of time that it now takes to make a stock trade, and the number of stock trades is the blue line. And when we look around, we see the consequences of this, that crises are rippling across systems and sectors and geographies, outrunning our responses. And while global systems create new potential for growth, they also have been accelerating inequality and environmental degradation, and that won't reverse without intervention. Looked at through one lens, these realities create daunting new challenges, but they also create amazing new opportunities. Fortunately, periods of uncertainty like these give rise to unconventional ideas. The Great Depression spurred an amazing amount of creativity. HP, Disney, CNN, and GE all started during periods of economic recession, and after the last dot-com bust, we saw a staggering increase in IP patents. The vast bulk of our institutions and individuals, however, are not equipped to deal with this kind of flux. At first, the impulse is always to look at the past, to turn to the tried and true for solutions. But I think we've learned that the solutions of the past are becoming more and more obsolete. So we have to understand that in order to adapt, we have to build in greater capacity going forward for constant change and therefore constant innovation. Where will we look for leadership to catalyze and foster this innovation? Rarely do we think of our leaders as innovators. And rarely do we think of innovators as leaders. In fact, it's hard these days to know what some people even mean by the word innovation. It's become a buzzword. We're bombarded with products that label themselves as innovative. And it's not just in the way we describe our products. It's actually how we describe ourselves. In 2010, innovative was the second most used term on LinkedIn, second only to extensive experience. But luckily for us, the incredible panel that we've brought together today embodies that wonderful combination of leadership and innovation. And before I bring them out, I just want to tell you a quick story that I think is appropriate for our conversation today. Over the past several years, villagers in a small Bangladeshi town had been struggling with the effects of a dramatic increase in flooding due to climate change. The floods were decimating their livestock, which were primarily chickens. Throughout the history of the village, floods were believed to have been punishment from a higher power. But recently, a Red Cross worker explained the effects of climate change to them and told them that they had to be prepared for more and more flooding. So the community began to focus on what could be done. And one bright woman hit upon the great idea of raising ducks instead of chickens. Because after all, what are ducks if not flood-proof chickens? So she got a hold of a few ducks, and not only did her family's source of eggs and meat survive the next flood, but she became a successful entrepreneur, selling ducks and their products to neighboring villages. Let's hear from our panel on how we can convert chickens to ducks. Our first panelist is Soraya Salti. She's the Regional Director of INJAZ Al Arab, an organization that harnesses the mentorship of Arab business leaders to help inspire a culture of entrepreneurial spirit and business innovation among Arab youth. Her efforts have led to amazing, innovative public-private partnerships in education, reaching more than 1 million youth in the region with the world's highest youth unemployment. Soraya lived, of course, through the heart of the Arab Spring and represents real-time revolution, how young people in particular are using this current fluid political environment to invent and start and scale innovations. Soraya Salti. Roger Martin is the Dean of the Rotman School of Management. His research spans integrative thinking, business design, corporate social responsibility, and country competitiveness. He is an influential, deeply influential global business leader and business thinker. His video, The Power of Changing the Way You Think, which is a mini case study on Procter & Gamble, is required viewing for anyone who cares about business or innovation. And in this month's Harvard Business Review, really required reading for anyone in this room, is Roger's newest article, where he is arguing that the Malthus solution and the Solo solution, approaches to sustainability of each of them, must be blended and applied in context in order to achieve real progress in all sectors. Roger Martin. And lastly, Patrick Meier, Director of Crisis Mapping at Ushahidi, an internationally recognized thought leader on the application of new technologies for crisis early warning, humanitarian responses, human rights, and civic resistance. He champions the power of a shared space for those who have skills to offer and are willing to learn skills to assist crisis-affected communities through the use of crowdsourcing and mapping technologies. Patrick Meier. And I am the lucky one who gets to ask them questions. So let me start with you, Soraya. You live in an extremely volatile region with a great deal of possibility and a great deal of uncertainty. How can you and how are you exploiting volatility to foster innovation, to bring about new ideas, to create new ways of thinking, especially those that might benefit poor and vulnerable communities?
All we hear is a thawra, the revolution, the revolution. Well, it turns out the Arab youth are connected, and that was a big assumption that we got wrong. So we thought that looking into schools and in Morocco, in Egypt, that no computers, no connectivity, that it meant that Arab youth were not connected. But in fact, in 2011, you spoke about the 800,000 Facebook users. Well, the new users were being pushed globally, those numbers, from the Arab world with Arab youth, ages 15 to 25, for one purpose: mobilization and demonstration, online and physical world combined. So after the revolution, our door is knocked, and it's one of our students that were in the entrepreneurship program a few years back saying, "You helped me, but you need my help now." And basically, he was a marketing vice president in his student company that we forced to liquidate. He went on to help us in Morocco with a website that he said he'll do pro bono, and now he wanted a contract of $15,000 a year to help us go on social media, because a revolutionary, he had learned all the ins and outs, had all the maps of it, who was the biggest Twitter user and who were the followers, etc. And now we were going to change, because he wants every INJAZ program to have a social media component. So number one, leadership skills. Since the Arab youth revolutions were taken hostage, how do we hone the leadership skills of Arab youth so that they can take it back? And it's just temporary, the current situation. And so what we do is start a leadership program, but now online. The biggest Twitter person followed by Arab youth on Twitter, Ahmed Shuqairi, videos on instructions to Arab youth across campuses on doing leadership programs, honing their leadership skills, but at the same time, community service and improving the communities around them. And so one session after the next, who is the biggest winner? The one that has the most likes on Facebook, that's 50% of your grade, and the one that created the most impact. So instead of reaching a few classrooms on a campus of 10 classrooms or 500 kids, now we reach the 30,000 students on each campus. And the most important thing is that there is no Arab Spring without an Arab education revolution. And for the first time, there's a wrinkle in time. Instead of waiting for education reform never to take place, we can now access students directly through these new technologies and let them be empowered to create their own educational experience and the skills that they want to see going into the Arab economies.
Patrick, you too have lived through upheaval. Give us an example of an innovation that you've seen born out of a time of chaos and flux.
Sure, and I think to put that into context, I'd be talking about humanitarian crises. And in a way, these crises are first and foremost a crisis in information, a crisis in communication, a scarcity of available information. And when you have scarcity, you also have usually innovation that follows, right? Scarcity drives innovation. And for better or worse, what we're seeing with these humanitarian organizations is that they're less and less able to provide the kind of information that's needed. And that basically means they're not perhaps as relevant the way they are today as they might have been a few years ago. So I'll give you an example that's very close to heart, Ushahidi. So during Kenya's post-election violence in 2007, the country was on the brink of basically going into a major crisis. More than 1,000 people were going to be killed, serious human rights abuses were already being committed, and massive displacement was going to follow. And I was raised in Kenya, and I was visiting my parents at the time. And I remember the government doing its best to downplay the severity of the situation. But at the same time, I saw bloggers, Kenyan bloggers, and citizen journalists starting to etch a very different picture of the situation, as evidenced and as reflected by the big data, if you'd like, of eyewitness accounts that were swarming around the social media space. So amidst this crisis, as Kenya began to slip towards what many feared was the abyss, we launched the Ushahidi platform. And Ushahidi basically means witness or testimony in Swahili, and it's a tool to give voice to the voiceless. In a simple way, think about the Ushahidi platform, the software, is a multimedia inbox connected to a live map. So within this inbox, we're receiving text messages, emails, tweets, photographs, as well as video footage, voicemails, what have you. So in Kenya, we set up a free SMS number that allowed anyone to basically testify by text message. And basically, we were receiving these text messages in our inbox and mapping them. And in this particular way, the crowd itself was able to document collectively and publicly human rights abuses that would have otherwise gone completely undocumented. And what we see now, fast forward to 2012, is this Ushahidi technology made in Africa being exported to over 140 different countries around the world, including the US. In fact, about 2 years ago in Washington, D.C., the platform was used to help the capital of the superpower, if you'd like, dig itself out of a massive snowstorm. So what we have really is here is reverse innovation from Africa out of Africa, and technology born out of crisis.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Roger. You're an extraordinary and innovative thinker and have influenced so many in business and elsewhere, but now you're also training students. Jonah Lehrer has a new book called Imagine How Creativity Works, and he argues that the ability to innovate is a teachable skill. Do you think it really is a teachable skill? Are business schools teaching it? And how do we really frame then skills training, particularly to respond to Flux?
Well, Jonah, if you haven't read his stuff, he's terrific, and I agree wholeheartedly. And in fact, I think it's just absolutely, without question, you can teach innovation, but neither business schools nor the formal education system, I think, does enough of teaching innovation. And one of the reasons is an argument that says you can't teach it, which I think strikes me as an odd kind of argument. But the argument basically is, if something is untaught, it's unteachable. I hardly think that's an innovative thought. But I think the entire if you think about your own education, right? How much of that education was about kind of understanding and analyzing and categorizing and documenting what is, right? Just think about it for a minute, right? How much of your education was that versus creating that which does not now exist? And I would say it's 95-5 in the formal education system overall. And so it comes to me as no surprise that we don't have as many innovators. Now, I think the social entrepreneurs in this room will innovate regardless of what anybody does to them or tries to do them. They'll just do it. So I don't think that the education system can drive innovation out of people who are naturally innovative. But I don't think that it is geared enough to that. I think it can be taught, I know, because we teach it at our business school, and the students love it. The students absolutely love to create and think about methodologies for creating that which does not now exist, rather than spending all their waking moments at business school analyzing, should I do this X that we already know exists, or this Y we already know exists? I mean, that's good. You'd rather do the better one of the two, but man, that's not where the fun is. And MBA students love when they're given the opportunity to do it. But I think it has to happen before that. We're now spreading out and doing a lot of our innovation training with high schools. And those students are also sort of impoverished on that front, and they love it. And we've already started to experiment in elementary schools. So you can teach it all the way through, and it's one of the lamest excuses I've ever heard that you can't teach innovation.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's stay with framing what context is necessary in order for innovation to be more enabled. So the concept of flux sort of implies that big societal fluctuations could really create a framework in which innovation is more likely to occur. But it requires certain behavior changes on the part of institutions and people. What kinds of behavior changes, and this is for any of you, do you think are most necessary for innovation to be fostered?
Well, at least in our region, the first quote that one of the top business leaders in the Arab world said was from Tahrir Square to an entrepreneurship revolution. And then our own executive director, who's right here from Egypt, she was talking to youth, 1,000 of them, all young entrepreneurs, saying, you've achieved the impossible politically, and now you've got to achieve the impossible economically, which meant that they've got to now go on and become, job creators instead of waiting for jobs. And what we've saw in the Arab Spring is a moment that we have never seen in our 10 years of working with youth across 15 Arab countries. They had collapsed everything patriarchal, from their home that even covered girls, 18, 19, 25, leaving notes to their parents saying, I'm leaving to Tahrir Square, see you when I see you, don't worry about me. And same thing for the boys, and 17 days later they were going back home, not as youth, but as adults, as equal adults. And the morning after was, oh my God, I've toppled the government that owed me a job. I've gone against my family, and now I've got to create my own job. I'm responsible for my own self, and we started to see that on the ground. So as we were going through entrepreneurship labs, you know, where students with help from volunteers are trying to start companies that we're forcing to liquidate, they were going out and registering those companies legally. Now, what was most inspiring was the females. Well, the females, it turns out, we saw in 2007, our first team that won was Wa'd al-Tawil, her name, the long-awaited promise for a young girl out of Ramallah to win our whole entrepreneurship competition. So our business leader in 2009, Bank of New York Mellon, was one of the Pan-Arab judges. So he was saying, I can't believe this. After the 3 days of judging, and we look at the numbers, and the top 3 contestants, female, 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 out of 15 countries. And he said, what a lost opportunity that Arab women are not part of the labor market. Well, 2012, and everyone is interested in researching Arab youth. We had no statistics, historically speaking. And the finding was incredible. Between the age of 15 to 25, the #1 priority for young women that age was economic independence. And so when the men, 60% of them were saying housewife, raising kids. So a big shift had happened. The grandmother was illiterate, the mother was literate, and here this generation of 15 to 25-year-old females are the 60% of all university graduates in the Arab world. Well, the title of the latest report coming out from Booz, and it says, okay, educated, ambitious, essential, women will drive the GCC's future. And amen.
That's great. Amazing, spontaneous occurrences that really are behavior changes nobody could have imagined 2 or 3 years ago. What about institutions, Roger? You study institutions, so how does their culture either create or inhibit the framework for innovation, particularly, again, in times of uncertainty when they're responding to risks, which could make them more cautious?
Yeah. For me, I think the big thing that we need to have a shift in to get more innovation, because you're right, in big institutions, lots of innovation is accidentally squelched. And I think what we have in the sort of modern big institutions is an overbalance of scientific logic. And science is great, scientific logic is great, but the problem with using science, analytical logic, is that you cannot prove any new idea in advance with inductive and deductive logic, the cornerstones of scientific reasoning. It's not doable. And so as the world gets, the business world at least, the institutional world gets more and more scientific, any innovator comes up with a new idea and they get told, well, you need to prove that. You can't. Full stop, you can't. And you have to recognize that all new ideas are only proven to be successful through the passage of time. Trying them, some of them fail a little bit, some of them fail a lot, you improve them, and they get better. But there is a view that says, if your new idea is so great, you can prove it in advance that it'll work. Impossibility, can't do it. And so that's what gets institutions in their own way. They'll say, gosh, we're trying to be so rigorous about innovation, right? And we don't get any innovation. God, how can that possibly be? Well, how can it possibly be? It's because that's what you're gonna produce is squelching innovation accidentally.
Fantastic. Patrick, you are the technology guru, and I think people have really been stunned by the viral nature of the Coney 2012 video. And it certainly demonstrates part of the power of social media to connect people to a problem around the globe. And yet, obviously, it has been enormously criticized as simplification beyond. But the power of social media is real. So how can social entrepreneurs innovate to ensure that these kinds of opportunities are real, but they do more than just create a media circus, and they don't simplify what are really complicated, important, difficult issues?
Oh, wow, thank you for reserving the easy question. Appreciate it. Let me try and be disruptive and answer that indirectly.
Good.
There is incredible power with social media, and I really like the theme that you were building on, the idea of institutional behavior either inhibiting or promoting innovation, and this idea of spontaneity as well, which is, I'll wrap back up to that. But so if you look at that, within, again, bringing it back to the context that I'm most familiar with, which is a humanitarian space, when you have a crisis, you have spontaneous organization and response, right? But that does not come from humanitarian organizations, because these humanitarian organizations tend to be rather heavy, slow-moving, and definitely not as innovative. So what we're seeing, thanks to social media and the fact that disaster-affected populations are increasingly the source of big data in the humanitarian context, we're having a radical shift in humanitarian response, because originally humanitarians would focus on their own information and collect their own information and analyze their own information, but more and more they're not on the scene, and instead of that you have a digitally empowered disaster-affected population that basically shares information in near real time in a very multimedia kind of ways. And this was particularly true if you look at Haiti, what happened during the earthquake about 2 years ago. Massive earthquake strikes Port-au-Prince. I saw the news, and a few hours later set up an Ushahidi platform, and then got some friends to help me map people's tweets. There were dozens and dozens of Twitter users in Port-au-Prince tweeting about the impact, and we started mapping that information. And what's rather remarkable is that this map then became centerfold to some of the humanitarian response that was happening because of social media. And so what I like to look at in terms of social media, and you mentioned Coney, and obviously that's an interesting example, is okay, they use social media to speak for themselves, right? This was Invisible Children saying, we feel strongly about this particular context with the LRA in Uganda and Central African Republic. What we did is turned around, and thanks to partners who led the way at Al Jazeera, we created an Ushahidi map to let Ugandans themselves speak about what they feel in terms of what their issues are. Is it really the LRA? Well, actually, more than not, it has nothing to do with the LRA. So we created a live social media Ugandan Speaks map that allowed people on the ground to basically speak for themselves, as opposed to have some external organization thousands of miles away sort of cast Uganda in a certain light, when in fact this is not the issues that they're grappling with. So anyway, I was a bit here and there, but hopefully that gives you some power.
Not an indirect answer, that was actually spot on. So this is one of those moments in time when we really believe that human and capital resources are underutilized, that there really is more capacity than is being used. How do we bring these underutilized resources together to be part of the innovation economy, part of the innovation society, when they are feeling marginalized, or underemployed, and certainly unheard? How do we do that? Any panelists, Roger?
Well, on that front, I'm probably almost more confident than anything else I can think about. I mean, I think I think kind of utilizing underutilized resources, we've got a better possibility of doing that than I think we ever have, right? And it's a funny sort of question for tonight with Jeff Skoll here. I mean, Jeff Skoll helped us figure out how to utilize underutilized kind of assets by creating eBay, and we've now got lots of kind of internet-based ways of letting people know they're other people know they're underutilized, and so I think the kinds of things you're doing, Patrick, and are just part and parcel of the platforms that are now being built, the infrastructure to help people around the world identify themselves as having capacity to give, and people being able to find that capacity. So I think we can eke out a lot more sort of prosperity and growth from just bringing up that underutilization of assets by having a better way to communicate.
Fantastic. Jump in.
Yeah, let me build on that. That's a great example of this in action was about 2 years ago during the massive Russian fires that really devastated large parts of Russia, hundreds of fires leading to some 50,000 people being killed. And for many reasons, including corruption, the Kremlin was simply not up to the task in dealing with this kind of the scale of the disaster. But amidst, again, this particular crisis, some Russian friends, colleagues of ours, activists, who had been inspired by what we had done in Haiti, decided to launch their own Ushahidi platform and started to basically crowdsource and map the needs of the disaster-affected population. But they did something else that was particularly innovative that hadn't been done before. Not only were they crowdsourcing the problems and the impact, but they were starting to crowdsource solutions. They were crowdsourcing offers for help. And in many ways, you could think of that as crowdsourcing agency, crowdsourcing positive deviance, because clearly the Russian government was nowhere to be found. And in fact, that particular initiative, within a few days, these volunteers sprung up and in many respects launched their own citizen-based disaster agency that was far more public, far more visible and effective, according to many, than the actual Russian government's own response. And what they were doing with this idea of crowdsourcing problems and solutions is they were, in a way, doing open source like Match.com for humanitarian response, right? If you think about it, right? There were, obviously, locally, there were resources to be had that could be connected, but they were being underutilized. And what you needed to have is a matchmaker, like this particular Russian I can't even call it a group, just distributed volunteers using the Ushahidi platform to act as a Match.com. And they were also setting up a call center to service the elderly as well. So what these platforms and technologies are allowing us to do is basically act as a way to facilitate self-organized action, regardless of whether the Russian state or other governments or institutions are there or not. And we know for a fact that the vast majority of survivals that happen in humanitarian crises have nothing to do with external intervention, with foreign aid, with humanitarian response, teams that come in 72 hours after the fact. It's all local. So if we can connect the local needs with the local resources, then I think we can build more resilient, innovative, ultimately, societies.
Soraya, you want to try it?
And the interesting thing in our region is, when 70% of your population are youth, and those youth become the number one, critical issue or social, or for governments, all of a sudden this is the top priority. Then, and elected governments are coming in and promising, 400,000 jobs and 300,000 and 1 million jobs here and there, etc. That paradigm shift is critical, and that paradigm shift is the entrepreneurship imperative, at least in our region. That for these 100 million jobs that have to be created over the next 10 years, that there have to be an entrepreneurship seed planted. And for the first time, we're seeing a few governments immobile and unable to act and just appeasing, but a few governments really pushing forward and creating partnerships of private sector, of civil society and government together to start spurring that entrepreneurial spirit in youth. So for our region, it's about, how do we take this demographic and shift it so that we create our own prosperity. My bet is that the next economic frontier is going to be the outcomes of an entrepreneurship flurry across the Arab world, empowered by Arab youth.
Fantastic. I showed a slide as a joke of the US Congress when I talked about leadership and innovation, and often government is accused of inhibiting innovation, or at least not fostering within the way government operates innovation. You've just given us an example of at least trying to enable a change in government. How do you think about the governments of the future? After all, everything we do operates in a system, and like it or not, governments are part of that system, and they can prevent or protect or enable. So how do governments both foster innovation more broadly and within government foster the kind of innovative spirit that we celebrate here?
That's a toughie. I mean, as questions go, I mean, I guess.
Sorry.
No, it's a good. It's a great question. I mean, I answered on a couple of levels. I mean, I do think that governments have been better about fostering invention than innovation. So they go and give money to scientists to go invent things, and I think that's kind of important piece. But I think in some sense it's the easy thing for government to do, and I'd love to see government say, no, we have to figure out how to also spur that kind of innovation that comes from the consumer back to the organization. What do consumers want, and how can we deliver that for them? And I almost think that governments say, yeah, that happens, right? That happens once every 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, depending on your, and that's all that we're going to focus on, that one time when we get consumer feedback, which is up or, kind of up or down, rather than collecting on an ongoing basis, as in both of your situations, collecting on an ongoing basis and saying, how do we have to think about that? They're geared up to the electoral cycle as their consumer feedback, and that's not enough to be innovative. Like if any great company, if Apple or Google or whatever said, once every 6 years we're going to check what consumers want, or once every 4 years, I mean, they'd be done.
The election process, we accept
it. Yeah. Yes, that's true.
Any other thoughts?
Just to borrow, I guess, from Anne-Marie Slaughter in terms of what the role of government ought or could be, is to provide platforms for self-organization. I thought that was a succinct way to maybe identify what government might be in the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our panel.